This is the DRS train.
To paraphrase the old saying, it's not how fast it is, it's how you use it. I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by Ciaron Smith, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. Now, the Spanish Grand Prix typically doesn't offer the best racing. There is the odd exception to that, such as 1996 or, say, 2012. But I don't know about you, Ciaron, but I thought, at least from a strategic perspective, this was a reasonably interesting race.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Peter. Good to be with you again, of course. I think the strategies were generally split between the medium and the hard, or people who went medium and then put on a scrub set or a new set of softs for the final stint. And we saw some drivers extend their initial medium stint a bit longer, which is why they were able to utilize the softs in the end. It's all a bit more interesting, I think, when we have these dual strategies in a race. So at least we had that to look forward to. But at the end of the day, you have to say the medium soft was a much better strategy. All those drivers finished ahead of their teammates.
It's surprising, really, because we haven't seen the soft tyre as a particularly viable race tyre for quite some time now. And I think this is quite a rare example of seeing a dry race with all three tyre compounds being used. Because this so easily could have just been a one-stop, but the tyres obviously weren't built to last that long. So that may, even though, I mean, almost everyone did a two-stop. There were a couple of drivers that did three stops, which didn't work out particularly well. But it did mean there was some uncertainty. I mean, it was surprising to see people pitting so early. And it was interesting, particularly the strategy battle between Verstappen and Norris, because Norris managed to go longer on his first two stints and then was able to, I suppose, sprint a bit more for the final stint, but that still wasn't really enough to catch Max in the end, was it?
Yes, well, yeah, you have to think. I always think about the famous quote by Martin Brundle: "You can only lose a race into the first corner. You can never win it." But I think in races like today, you've got to say that quote's being put to the test. Because I think Lando lost the race in the first corner after his lackluster start. You've got to say, I mean, he had a horrible getaway. He got jumped by two cars, and as a result, he was on the back foot when it came to his strategy the entire time when compared to Max, as you alluded to. Overall, if I were looking at this race, I would say that he lost a bit of time in the first stint, but because he's got such a quick car under him, that McLaren is a general consensus, probably the quickest car around this circuit, and many others we've been to this circuit. So he was able to close back up to Max by the end of the race. And you've got to say, if you take into account the time that he lost in the first stint by being behind a Mercedes, you got to say he could have won this race, and that's a shocking admission, given how many races now we've been saying that about Lando, but he hasn't quite converted.
Yeah, I mean, he has his win now, of course, in Miami, but that was effectively handed to him on a plate. I mean, everything had to fall into place perfectly, and he even acknowledged, "I didn't overtake anyone and still won the race." But this time, yeah, without that start, and if he hadn't got stuck behind George in the first stint, he would have, well, at the very least, he would have got within DRS range of Max in that final stint. Whether or not he'd have passed him, I don't know. More than likely, because, I mean, this is one of the easier circuits to do overtakes on. But it's what it's kind of demonstrating, and we've seen this again with the previous race and just Max in general, is that he seems to have really peaked, and you can't, the only way you can beat him is to be just as seamless in how you drive, and that includes a mixture of both your own driving and also team strategy as well, because Red Bull it doesn't make much difference, but they had some absolutely seamless pit stops. I mean, they did another sub 2-second one, and the McLaren ones were around 3 seconds. It's just little things like that make a difference. And I think it's like, okay, things are close, and the top four are becoming especially close, but Max is still winning, and he's still extending that lead at the end of the day in a car which, well, if you were to look at Checo's driving, you would definitely say it's not the fastest car, but it's so marginal there that there's just no room for error at the moment.
I've got to agree with that. And you look at this race, and you look at how Max got by George, managed to lead. The team did a great job with the strategy. Red Bull, I mean, and they had a pretty defensive strategy. They had to really push all the way to the end to make sure that McLaren never really had a chance to close up that gap. But Max got ahead of George so quickly that it was almost as if he was leading really into turn one. I mean, he didn't really lose anything by being behind George. And I think at the end, you could see that Red Bull just didn't have the pace of the McLaren. And the McLaren were much better on the tires. Both Red Bull drivers were complaining about grip, about tire degradation. And that's an area that Red Bull will be looking to improve, I think, in the next races, because you've got to say, I mean, everybody's been giving Lando driver of the day and been saying what a great job he's been doing. I think it's shocking. I think his performance was absolutely shocking. It's just not good enough. I mean, first he rocks up into the paddock and says that George had a quicker car in Canada, which by itself is a very dubious statement. There's no evidence that the Mercedes was quicker than the McLaren, in my view. He's had the quickest car now for about 3 weekends in a row. And the only reason he won Miami, as you mentioned earlier, was because of a safety car error effect that gave him a huge advantage. And yet again, he had the quickest car this weekend, and he just couldn't get it done. It's something that I'm not sure the fans understand how Formula One works, but if you have the quickest car, the bare minimum is that you win. And he isn't doing that right now. So it's not giving us the season that we all deserve. It's giving us a very one-sided season in the standings, even if the cars are much closer this year. And to top it off, it just looks like Red Bull are still able to win because they have very much the best driver in the sport. I was shocked after this race. I thought Norris was shocking. I mean, that McLaren car, is the quickest car in Formula One right now. And to have one driver drop to third and finish second, and what was the other one doing? Seventh? That's unacceptable.
It was another race where, and we saw this loads of times last year, people would say this would be an amazing race if Max wasn't in it, because you saw amazing battles for second and everything. And this one, yeah, because Max got past George, lap 3. Lando, it took a lot longer. I can't remember if it was after the first pit stops, but there was that. He had that very nice battle with George all the way from turn 1 to turn 7 and came out on top. And it's like, yeah, that would have been amazing if that was for the lead, but obviously it was for second again. I mean, Max's race was he had one little off at turn 7 in the first stint. He didn't lose much time on it, but other than that, he drove seamlessly. The strategy was all well considered, and the pit stops were really fast, because even though Lando ran longer in his first 2 stints, and so he had a shorter final stint, but then after Max pitted, Max was pitting for new softs, and Lando had to put used ones on. So either way, Lando had to run longer to keep to kind of put the tires on sort of equal footing. If he'd had new softs, maybe he could have caused them a bit faster. So that having that in the bank made a difference to Red Bull, because it could afford them to pit a bit earlier. It's just the little things like that. I mean, with Lando himself, he's now on his 6th season in Formula One, more than 100 race starts. This is the first time he's had, what is the fastest car in a car that is genuinely fast enough for race wins, other than the odd exception where there's just a good weekend. I mean, we've seen, 2020, we saw the first hints of his talent with the whole last lap Lando thing. And, 21, there was the race win that never happened. But at this point, it's like, think about where Max was after 6 seasons. That was 2020, where he was running constantly behind the Mercedes in an objectively slower car, or like Hamilton and Vettel and Schumacher, they all already had championships by this point, and he has he has one win from almost 20 podiums. Yeah.
To answer your earlier question about, when did Norris pass Russell in that first stint? I don't think he did pass. I don't think he did pass Russell. So, I mean, the problem is that Russell pitted on lap 15, and then Norris took the lead after Verstappen pitted 2 laps later.
Was it
As far
George
as
or was it wasn't Lewis?
no, it was George and Max who were in front of him, and they both pitted, and then Norris pitted some 7 laps after Verstappen,
And came out
um,
much
and
further
came out. No,
behind.
and still, yeah, and came out and was still behind Russell when he came out. Um, I think at the end of the day, um, that's when Norris passed Russell, was after he had made his first stop, basically, and then started gaining on Russell. So you've got to say he should have really made that move a lot earlier than he did. I mean, getting stuck behind George was not part of the game plan.
No.
George was driving. George was driving the third fastest car on the day. Lando was driving the quickest car. Um, that's a subpar performance. There's no other way to really describe that. Why are you getting stuck behind slower cars when you have the fastest car, when you have pole position? But I think the strategy wasn't wrong, I think, for McLaren. I can't really fault their strategy. I'm not sure what you think about that, but I just think they didn't have track position. And so they were continually bogged down. But I wouldn't have changed the tires that they put on the car and when they put those tires on. It's just it wasn't enough given the bad start, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean the strategy itself, there was nothing wrong with that. I don't think. I mean, it was to run longer is always good if you think you can sustain it. I mean, they kept going. I was thinking maybe this is a bit too long because he's going to lose even more time, and it's just a shame that they did this even knowing that they had to put used softs on because that took away too much of the advantage. Because new softs would have made enough difference certainly. The strategy, there was nothing wrong with that. I think most people played it well. Obviously, we saw in the final stint with George that going onto the hard ultimately wasn't the best idea, but that's just how it goes sometimes. But I think probably because we saw those two fighting at the front and for the win. That wasn't exactly the same for their teammates, though. There was quite a contrast there. I mean, with Oscar, past couple of races have not been brilliant for him. I mean, in Canada he was there or thereabouts, but was just never quite. He was never one of the ones fighting for the lead, but he was always just behind them. But this time he was kind of a ghost. I mean, he ended up starting 9th because he ran wide on his final run and didn't get a time in, or at least a good time in Q3. But he just wasn't. He was behind the Alpines for a while. He got past them eventually, but he just wasn't. He wasn't running at the pace that Lando was, and just wasn't in contention. By the end of the race, he caught up to the Ferraris who'd fallen behind, but was just too far off. And it's really not. It feels like the gap between him and Norris has widened, which seems odd because he's not a rookie anymore.
Absolutely, he made his life with Piastri. He really made his life difficult. With his poor qualifying performance. Once you do that, you're always on the back foot, especially around a track like Catalunya or Barcelona. It's very difficult to pass at the circuit, and Piastri did himself no favors this weekend whatsoever. And even in the race, they really had to take some big strategic risks to kind of get him up. Where he was. He didn't have a ton of pace in general. So it's a second season. There are no excuses at this level. You've got to learn from your teammate and you've got to get better every race. Otherwise, some other young driver will pop up in 1 or 2 years and you'll be gone. So, again, I see a lot of coddling of these drivers. Oh, Norris, he's still young. It's his sixth season. It's his sixth season, and then the other one's in his second season. Enough coddling. It's time to perform. Otherwise, I'm sure your manager can secure a WEC contract or a NASCAR contract for you or an IndyCar contract because, frankly speaking, one of them at least finished second. To finish seventh in a car of the caliber that the McLaren is totally unacceptable. I mean, if I were Zach Brown, I would be pulling Oscar Piastri into a room and saying, right, yes, it's your second season, but it'll also be your last if this continues. Understand, it's not really acceptable. And maybe the reason that I'm so bothered by this is because I remember 1995. Well, I don't remember it because I started watching in 1997, but I watched the 1995 season later. And that was a season where you had two Williams drivers who could get lots of poles. Like David Coulthard had 5 poles in a row in 1995, for example. But they could never really convert the pace of their car, which I believe was slightly superior to that of the Benetton Renault. And that's a debate that you can have for hours, frankly. But my belief is that the Williams was a slightly better car, at the very least. And instead of having a nail-biting championship to the wire, which we should have had, we had a very boring season overall. 95 was not a classic, but it should have been. And that's where this season is heading. Max has a massive advantage for the relative speed of his car compared to the other cars. And it's because the others are just tripping over themselves. And frankly, it's disheartening to see. F1 could really have an all-time classic season this year. As you mentioned, you've got McLaren, you've got Mercedes now who are in the mix and getting poles. You've got Ferrari who won at Monaco, and you have Red Bull who are still a good team, even if they're not the quickest anymore. There's no excuse for Max Verstappen winning all these races like this. And that's where my frustration stems from. A quick note I want to make on something you mentioned. Russell did complain about those hard tires, but that actually, I think, helped Hamilton because they put Hamilton on softs right after he pitted, after that radio message. So I think they were probably thinking, my guess is either they were just going to use an alternate strategy or because George was having such a difficult time, maybe that further confirmed that they want to put softs on Lewis. So George is also not exactly that much, if at all, quicker than Lewis in the races, even if in qualifying he has been. So there's been some interesting teammate dynamics this season so far.
Well, the big scandal running into this weekend was the accusations of sabotage on Hamilton's car with that email that was sent. It was sent to all the same journalists that got the infamous Google Drive of all the WhatsApp messages of Christian Horner. I can't remember now if that email was sent by some deranged fan or a Mercedes employee or whatever. But yeah, they're just all claiming, the reason that George has been beating Lewis and Lewis has been kind of invisible is because they've sabotaged his car. And I'm thinking, if they'd sabotaged it, I think, well, first of all, good luck getting the entire team in on that, because if anyone that knows is like, no, we can't do this to him. But also, I feel like the gap would be much bigger because this is such a narrow field spread that he wouldn't be on average 2 or 3 tenths slower. He'd be like a whole second or more off if it was intentional sabotage. But this weekend, he got ahead of him just in qualifying by like a couple of hundredths faster than George. He ended up on what ended up being the better strategy. I mean, in that final stint, George didn't actually fall that far behind, even though he was on the worst. Hamilton got past him. He was obviously on the worst tyre, but he only finished a few seconds behind in the end. So there still wasn't much in it. But yeah, you can see McLaren are on the up because Hamilton had a good race. I mean, this is one of his strongest circuits. He's got, I think, 6 wins at Catalunya. And his first podium in 12 races as well. So that, yeah, he at least had a fairly good race.
Yeah. Well, I think it's clear that email came from some deranged fan or some lunatic because the team said it did not come from a team member. And Mercedes called the police, didn't they? over that email because apparently there was some mention of like life-threatening circumstances for Lewis. I mean, that's just unacceptable. I mean, if you're a fan out there sending emails like that and messages because of a person who you've never met, likely, who probably doesn't really care about you. My message to the fans who want to do that is you're putting yourself at risk. You're putting yourself at legal risk and putting yourself in a position of legal liability. So my message to the fans is don't do that.
I mean,
Incredibly stupid.
I mean, Lewis himself even spoke out and were like, "Yeah, don't just be kind." I guess is the message. So he was even one. I mean, even if he himself suspected they were sabotaging his car, he probably wouldn't put that publicly. He'd want to deal with that internally first of all, and there would be bigger signs. But yeah, we've seen this before. Like, was it beginning of last year when the Mercedes had to put out a statement to their fans apologizing for only having the fourth fastest car or something as well? It's just silly stuff like that. Yeah, you've got this to look forward to, Ferrari.
It's just strange. You're right. I remember that and thinking, what on earth are they doing? I mean, this is Formula One. These things can happen. It's about how you respond to them. And responding in the form of a tweet or an X post, whatever they're called now. I mean, that's just a bit, that's like hot air. It doesn't really do, it's all fluff. Doesn't do anything. I think Mercedes in general have made some incredible gains. So that pole position, I think, was more George Russell in the car last weekend. That's my hypothesis. But it was an amazing pole position. And the car is quick at certain tracks. They're not far off McLaren and Red Bull. And we saw that they were quicker than Ferrari. I mean, Hamilton was all over Sainz after his final stop. And he passed Sainz brilliantly into turn one. It was a great move by Lewis. And at the end, even when Leclerc was given team orders to pass Sainz and try and catch up to the Mercedes, who were one of them, Russell, was struggling with his tires, they still couldn't pass George. So they've made huge gains. The focus has been on McLaren, and rightfully so, because McLaren have the fastest car in Formula One, even if their drivers are underperforming. But Mercedes now have a car that at some tracks is the third quickest and not far off the top two. And it's quick enough to win. I mean, if any of the Red Bulls or McLarens have an off weekend, Mercedes will be right there to pick up the pieces, even in the state that they're in now. So you've got to say that's an incredible turn of events, given where they started at the beginning of the season. And it's only a matter of time. I think they will take a win this year at some, I don't know where. But the rate of development has been very impressive this year between the teams. I mean, between McLaren becoming the quickest team, Mercedes somehow breaking into the top three, Ferrari having their, moments this season. And then you even see teams like Alpine making huge gains where they're now in the bottom end of the top 10, when at one point they were the worst team on the grid. So the development race this year has been interesting. A lot of, simply put, excellent developments being introduced onto the car across various teams. So hats off to the engineering departments of these teams. They've done an amazing job. Then you have your exceptions like Aston Martin, but overall, Mercedes are looking good. Peter, what did you think about Ferrari this weekend? I mean, it looked like they were struggling with tires. It's just strange. They were so dominant at Monaco, and now the past 2 weekends they've looked like the fourth quickest team. What's your take on the Scuderia?
Yeah, not a brilliant race for them again. Obviously, far better than Canada. Going into the weekend, I thought maybe Sainz can win because it's so close to the front and he's got the extra impetus of it being his home race. He ended up having a very scrappy race, though. There is, with those top four, as close as they are, we saw it in both quali and the race, there is definitely a separation between McLaren and Red Bull and then Ferrari and Mercedes. I mean, in qualifying, there was a gap of 0.3 from Norris to Hamilton. and then third to sixth was like 0.03 of a second covering it, so a really tiny margin between all of them. And this played out in the race where they were like third down was like 18 seconds off of the leaders. But for them, yeah, it just didn't work. They said they were sort of playing their funny strategy games again. The pace obviously wasn't there, and I think they realised pretty quickly we're not in contention to win this. What everyone seems to be discussing now is the bickering between Leclerc and Sainz about when Leclerc did eventually pass Sainz, and they were complaining about pushing off the track. And then in the interviews afterwards, he was like, "Oh, he said something about, oh, he's always, complaining about something, and I can't wait to get away from this baby or whatever." So there's but then when it comes to Sainz, he's under no obligation to be loyal to that team anymore. With them, kicking him out against his will. So I don't really mind if he wants to complain a bit if things don't go his way.
It's shocking to me. I read a quote by Carlos Sainz, I think a few days ago, where he said, "The truth is that I'm friends with Charles Leclerc." What? Did I read that right? I'm friends with Charles Leclerc. I mean, Peter, really, it's just getting to a point now where I wonder, like, what these drivers really think they're doing there. I mean, do they think this is, grammar school? I mean, is this, the lads, having a smoke before Latin class or something? Like, I don't really understand what's going on with Carlos Sainz, because, he literally comes out and says, "Yeah, I could have behaved better in some moments earlier in the week," and then says, "The truth is I'm really good friends with Leclerc on and off the track." And then he comes out and says, "This guy always complains, and I'm looking forward to not, leaving the team and being in another team next year." While Leclerc came out with some extremely passive aggressive comments. I mean, you got to say, if I was Carlos Sainz, I would have confronted Leclerc in those comments. He said that this is an important moment in his career, sarcastically, as if he's achieved nothing. Carlos Sainz, in my opinion, probably made some political maneuvers during his time at Ferrari that didn't pay off. He didn't play the politics game as well as he should have. And I think he was too nice to Charles Leclerc. He should have done more to get into Charles Leclerc's head just as a person. Forget the politics, forget all that stuff. He should have really taken it to Charles on all levels, because the result is even though Carlos has really not been lagging behind Leclerc overall, he's the one that has to make room. And he should have realized that it was either him or Charles, and Charles is a very aggressive driver. I don't think people understand. He's got all these fans that are all touchy-feely, and we're talking about all these things like sensitivity of emotions. But the bottom line is Charles Leclerc is a very, very egotistical number one driver. This is somebody who, when he joined Vettel. I never forget this quote by Charles, and it sums up his mentality. Vettel said something like, "We shouldn't have a number one or two, we should just be equal." And Leclerc said, "No, I disagree. We should have a number one, but we should fight to see who that is." This is a very, very competitive teammate. And, I think Lewis will handle it, provided there's no age-related decline. I think Lewis will handle this much better than Carlos did, because, frankly speaking, I wouldn't have moved aside for Leclerc today. I would have said, if he's so much quicker, why is he behind me? As you said, Peter, Carlos doesn't owe this team anything. So it's in his best interest, I think, to really push back and send a message to all the teams that may be looking to sign him that he's every bit the equal of Leclerc. And, I wouldn't have faulted Carlos, because, look, Leclerc couldn't even pass one of the Mercedes despite being on fresher tires. But the bottom line is I'm just a bit shocked that Sainz was, in my opinion, relatively timid in his relationship towards Leclerc over these past few years. And it doesn't surprise me to see Leclerc lash out at his teammate the moment there's a little bit of contact, as there was in this race, because Charles is only interested in winning, and anybody that challenges him usually gets thrown under the bus or develops a tense relationship with him. Charles Leclerc is not a nice person. None of these drivers are. They just want to win. And when you rock the boat that they feel is stable for them, they lash out. So, anyways, I'm not surprised. I hope it continues and give us a little bit more entertainment. And, overall, Ferrari have a lot of work to do in order to build that consistency. Looks like it tracks at Monaco, where the temperatures are high. They're super quick, but you go to other circuits and they're very much the fourth quickest team. So a bit of work to do there. I'd like to just quickly get your thoughts on Alpine. Another great race by this team. I think they're really going places. I mean, think about where they were and the fact that they just got 2 double points finishes in a row. Gasly scored in the last 3 races. You got to tip their hat to them. They have been making gains. And apparently, they're also in the running now to sign Carlos Sainz in a surprise turn of events. Any thoughts on that, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was their best race of the season. And it is very underappreciated by a lot of people just how big the improvement has been. How far they were off at the beginning. Now, if this continues, they have basically put themselves back in the position they were in last year of being best of the rest with no competition in front or behind. But they just, it was a quiet race and it was just they just knuckled down and did their job. They did eventually get passed by the drivers who were out of position, but double points finish. And it's all the more impressive because there is a lot of drama and controversy going on at that team. The 2 drivers don't like each other. Ocon is being completely sort of scapegoated and kicked out. I mean, he was being booed at the fan zone this weekend and all of that. I didn't know the Spanish fans felt so strongly about this situation. The team are just firing people constantly. Bruno Famin is quite cantankerous as a team principal in the way he presents himself in the media. But when it comes to what matters, which is on-track performance, they're just improving more and more and more and getting themselves in a fairly good position. And by the end of the season, if this continues, they'll probably have overtaken. I think they've just passed Haas or maybe just behind them, but they probably could overtake Aston Martin at this rate and basically put themselves back where they were last year and come 5th in the constructors. So for them, overall, it was just they just knuckled down and did their job, and it was a very good race.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. And frankly speaking, I think they have very much consolidated, depending on where Aston Martin end up in a few races when they bring their new developments. Right now, get to rank the teams, I very much put Alpine as the 5th quickest car in Formula One again. That's what it looked like for the past 2 weekends. So I think if I were Carlos Sainz and Alpine is available, I'd be having a serious think about that because they've got bigger resources than Williams do. And if he isn't interested in the Audi project, which from the very flimsy rumors that we hear, he may not be interested in going to Audi, and the choice was between Audi and Williams, and he was leaning towards Williams. He may have a better starting point at Alpine, and he's also driven at the Enstone team before in the guise of Renault. So there is some familiarity there. So these are all things to consider as well for Alpine as they decide who replaces Esteban Ocon next year. So hats off to them. Apparently Ocon was, by the way, complaining that the car was kind of undrivable during the race. So to me, this was Gasly's best performance of the year. He was mega. He was super fast. He was clearly ahead of his teammate. Would like to see a weekend where there are no team orders involved and where Ocon doesn't have a handling imbalance as he had, because I think Esteban still holds a slight edge. But there's plenty of races to determine that. And speaking of teams that haven't made progress, you've got to say Aston Martin has been absolutely shocking in the way that they've dropped off out of the top 4 teams, and they were battling Saubers for most of this race. They desperately need their updates to work because Alonso said that 12th was the maximum for that car, and he finished behind a Haas. So, what on earth is going on there? I mean, that's just not good enough from the whole team. Any thoughts on that? I mean, I think they still must have some correlation issue in their wind tunnel. I mean, how can you go backwards every time you bring an update? It's just shocking.
Yeah, I mean their next round of downgrades is due to come in Hungary, I think. But they had, yeah, it's a shame because for Alonso, you know, it's his home race and all of that, and I mean he had. There was at least a bit of I don't think I saw Stroll at all the entire race, but with Alonso we saw him making some moves and then getting past a few times the first couple of stints. But yeah, they really should have been in the position that Alpine were in. That's what you would expect from them, and it's like, well, now Alonso, he's got that, you know, indefinite number of years on his contract to keep going with them. Stroll, everyone knows he's going to re-sign eventually, and they've said, yeah, it's coming whenever. But is Alonso really going to want to continue if the team stays like this, and it still keeps being this uncompetitive? Because this time last year they had just started to drop off, but before that, when they were second fastest, it's like, oh, you can see why this is working for him. But now it's like, why would you want to continue driving what is effectively the McLarens that you drove in the hybrid era? Not much better than those. They did get this morning. There was news they've signed one of Ferrari's engineers as their new team principal. Enrico Cardile is now going to them next year. So that can only help, I would have thought. I mean, people are going to look at this and think, oh, that's going to create a vacancy for Adrian Newey at Ferrari. But so that's a fairly decent signing. Again, I think with Lawrence, it's just, you know, we can cash some very big checks that some of the other teams maybe can't. But now, it's depressing that because Mercedes have clearly got on top of not understanding the car and they've got the upgrades and they made it work. But every time Aston Martin bring upgrades, the car just gets slower. So I really don't know what's going on with their aero department.
Yeah, Enrico Cardile is a huge signing. It does open up a technical director spot at Ferrari. I don't know what is prompting these people to sign with Aston Martin. Is it really the facility? Is it Alonso? Is it just the money? But at the end of the day, you need to have a team structure in place as well. You can have a bunch of big names, but if they're not working well together, as we saw at McLaren in the early 2000s, it can basically be very unproductive and not yield the results that people expect. So, yeah, Aston are signing some big names, but we've yet to see if that's going to yield anything. Before I go on, I just have a message for the fans that booed Esteban Ocon in the fan zone. And I forgot to talk about this because this actually really bothers me. Because the only reason that they're booing him is because because he spoke back. Because he talked back to the master. Because he talked back to their favorite driver. Is that really a reason to boo him? My message is this. Deberías avergonzarte de ti misma. You should be ashamed of yourselves. That's a Formula One racing driver who has every right to challenge any other driver on the grid. Enough. I've seen this abuse go towards Ocon, and it's always the 75% of this vicious abuse is coming from Spaniards in Spain. And I was the brunt of this for so many years when I started my YouTube channel too. They are relentless. They are even more relentless than Alonso. Just stop already. It's ridiculous. You know? And anyways, if Alonso is so good, why doesn't he have a better teammate? What is he afraid of? Anyways, that's also a bad argument. But my point is that I wasn't thrilled when I read that. That actually really bothered me. Moving on, I think, Aston Martin, big name signing. It's an amazing signing, as you said, Peter, but they really need to get a grip first of all on this season and fixing their car and the developments. I think Alonso did close to the maximum. He still finished behind a Haas, even though Nico had a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. So that's not very encouraging. And Stroll was just absolutely nowhere as far as I can see. He was on a good run. He was out qualifying Alonso for a few races. I don't know what that says about Fernando, but it didn't really carry into this weekend. So lots of work there. I don't know if that team is even quicker than Alpine at the moment. So, they have a lot of work to do. Down the order, I mean, it was just all going on. I mean, I'm not sure if there was any team that really stood out to you. I thought RB were Visa Cash App, RB were atrocious. That team had absolutely no pace this weekend. Sauber were their usual anonymous self. And I want to just point out that, Logan Sargent probably had one of the worst weekends of his career as well. He was miles behind his teammate this weekend. So some shocking performances all around, wouldn't you say, in the lower midfield, Peter?
Yeah. Somebody who, well, they were running more in the upper midfield, which you would see more as the lower midfield from where they should be, though, was Sergio Perez. So this weekend, again, he made it to Q3, barely, and then carried over his grid penalty from the last race. So he started 11th. Without the grid penalty, he would have started 8th. He was still some 6/10 off the front row in Max's car. And he finished the race in, 8th as well. Christian is only coming out with positive words, which is all the more infuriating. But he just hadn't. They put him on a 3-stop. He eventually passed the Alpines. It took him the entire race to do it. But it is just getting really frustrating that it wasn't like it was a weekend where he made any obvious mistakes or anything. He just wasn't fast at all. And I made this in the last video about how we used to have, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren. All of there were 5 drivers when there should have been 6 because of Massa, and it's happening now is that there were 7 drivers when it should have been 8 because he's the one falling behind, much more so than Piastri did. And you're just thinking, how can this keep going when you think he signed that contract? Surely that would relax him, knowing he's there for another 2 years. You'd think that would help. But it's obvious that it's got nothing to do with mental strength or confidence. It's just the pace just is not there.
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to disagree with that, frankly. I've been flabbergasted by Perez. He's been so off the pace. At some point, you got to look at yourself in the mirror and say, am I good enough for this anymore? And, he's been struggling to get out of Q1 in a Red Bull. That's unacceptable. And if I were Red Bull, I'd be having a good look at maybe breaking his contract and maybe signing somebody else because, you can't win constructors titles in close races with somebody who's underperforming to this extent. It's just outrageous. They had to put him on a 3-stop in the race at Barcelona. And so he managed to make up some good points and, at the end of the day, finished an amazing 8th place. 8th. What's he doing out there? It's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. So, it remains to be seen if this was in Red Bull's best interests, despite the commercial backing that he brings, because he is really underperforming in a way that we haven't really seen in Formula One in a very long time. I mean, I don't think it was wise to sign him to 2 more years because, like you said, he's been given assurances. He's almost been coddled by Red Bull. He's been given the contract extension so early. And you'd think that would settle his mind, that maybe now he can get his act together. The only thing he's been getting is eliminated in Q1. I'm just shocked. Really. Formula One is supposed to be a meritocracy. you'd be hard pressed to think that if you look at the way Sergio Perez has time and time again managed to secure contract extensions. So we'll see. I think he's going to cost them the constructors' title at some point, and that's when I think Red Bull will wake up and realize they need to make a change.
Yeah, I mean this weekend they just about got the most points of any team, but that was because Max was winning the race. So let's think. Red Bull got 29 points, McLaren got 25, Mercedes got 27, Ferrari got 18. So they still got the most points, but only just. And again, because Max won.
Perez is so lucky in a way because last weekend Ferrari didn't score any points, so his horrific performance didn't cost the team as much. And then this weekend, Piastri went and did his best GP2 impression, did his best impression of a GP2 driver. So again, Perez was saved because Piastri underperformed. The Ferraris were slower than usual, and Mercedes weren't quite quick enough to challenge. So that won't last. There will be weekends where Piastri and Norris are closer together, where Ferrari are quicker, and Perez will not be able to hide behind the brilliance of Max Verstappen when we look at cumulative points scored by a team. And he's lucky that Max is winning all these races because otherwise I think he'd have a lot more scrutiny on him in an ironic way because Red Bull are saying, well, we're getting the points. Sergio's not rocking the boat. What's the problem? The problem is when McLaren start getting 1-2s. Well, I say that they haven't really done that yet, but ostensibly, if they start getting 1-2s with the pace of the car that they have, then that's going to put Red Bull under some serious pressure because they only have one performing driver. So maybe that's what it will take for Perez to be seriously questioned in the team.
Yeah, I mean, because at the moment Max has a lead in the drivers' standings of 69 points, but Red Bull have a lead in the constructors of 60 points. So that's a smaller advantage, and it's just at the moment it's manageable. But if this carries on, it won't be because Checo is on. He has slightly over half of Max's points. He's 108 points behind him, and he's on 111. Just got passed by Sainz. He's now fifth in the standings. Hasn't had a podium since China. Again, they've got what is now probably the second fastest car, but I think of the 10 races, they've had 3 1-2 finishes and 2 front row lockouts. Whereas Mercedes in 2015, I think they had something like it was over 70% of each for both races of 1-2s and front row lockouts. Yeah, it is just him desperately underperforming, and the way that Christian keeps coming out saying, "Oh, apparently Spain should be encouraging for him or whatever." So what encouraging that he made it to Q2? Like, there's nothing encouraging about this. He finished a whole minute behind. I mean, in the third of his 4 stints, he was actually gaining on Max, but then he was on a short stint. In his final stint, the pace was more or less matched, but by that point he was a minute behind, so it doesn't matter. But we haven't. Even in the race where he was finishing second, he was finishing like 30 seconds behind. So he's getting found out, dare I say, or exposed at this point.
I have never seen such a low bar set for a driver in such a fast car. I have never seen this. That Christian Horner is repeatedly coddling this driver in the media. And it makes me think that there's a part of this story that none of us know about because usually if you underperform to this extent, you are put under pressure by your team. You get comments directed to you. Helmut Marko has been completely silent. We know why that is. And Christian Horner is just so unbelievably supportive of a driver that isn't really supporting the team. So I've never seen this. You're in the second quickest car at worst in Formula One, and you're getting applauded for your incremental improvements every weekend when you were just knocked out of Q1. I mean, if I were a team boss, I'd be having a go at Perez. You know, I'd be furious. But anyways, we'll see how that story ends. Anybody else that you wanted to touch on, Peter? Look, I think Haas, quickly, I wanted to talk about them because both of their drivers had penalties in the race. Magnussen had the false start. Hulkenberg sped in the pit lane. But I actually think Haas could have probably gotten a point today. And everyone's saying Nico drove so well because he beat Magnussen. Well, Kevin had a horrific race, but Nico probably cost himself some points with that speeding 5-second penalty in the pit lane because Ocon had some serious handling issues today and points were on the table. So I think both Haas drivers were not exactly up to par this weekend, if I have to be honest. I'm not sure if you have any incremental thoughts on that, but
well, with Hulkenberg, I mean, he received the 5-place penalty after the race had finished, or the 5-second penalty, so it didn't affect his position. But he was only a few seconds behind Ocon. So I mean, yeah, I think so. I don't think he did, other than the speeding. I don't think he did anything wrong in the race. It's just that it wasn't quite there because Alpine were just a little bit faster. But with Magnussen, there was a pretty obvious gap there because he qualified behind him. He was nowhere near him in the race. I mean, he was, we saw the false start penalty, and then that he was getting overtaken and doing stuff like that, but it was all just quite far back. It wasn't really a good race for anyone to try and make gains because we didn't see any retirements, which is becoming more and more common, which is relatively rare, I guess. But yeah, just so that they now, maybe at this point, they have been displaced by Alpine as best of the rest. And so they're going to need to be dependent on retirements or errors further up to get a couple of points here and there.
Totally agree with you. One thing I want to point out about Nico's penalty, though, is that he was pushing hard to catch Ocon, and then the team and Nico decided to back off. And the reason they decided to back off was because in order for Nico to finish ahead, he would have needed to pass Ocon and then create a 5-second gap, which they thought wouldn't be great for the tires and potentially cause him to have a tire failure or drop even further back. That's in the words of the team principal. So you're right. It didn't affect Nico on the track, but in a way, it affected his approach because he just thought this isn't possible and backed off. While if he didn't have that penalty, maybe he would have gone for the move, knowing that he could maybe only stay 1 or 2 seconds ahead instead of the 5. With Magnussen, I agree with you. Again, just making errors. It's not great. I think this team needs an overhaul, and I personally think it needs an overhaul potentially beyond just the drivers. There's something not clicking in this team. There's something not good enough about the man management of the drivers. Why do they make so many mistakes? And if I were a team principal, I'd make that clear to them. It's like, look, you may not be the fastest driver in F1, but cut out the mistakes. It costs this team a lot. It's making a mockery of the team. And I don't know if their current team principal is forceful enough to do that. So you've got to say this whole Gene Haas project has been an abysmal failure. I mean, I don't think of them as America's team. I don't think they've even signed an American driver. And nobody's really excited to have them on the grid. I mean, what do you think about that, Peter? I mean,
this season is one of their better ones. I think their fortunes have improved considerably ever since they got rid of Gunter. He was just a burden at the end of the day in terms of, okay, yeah, it was entertaining, but it wasn't good for actually having a functioning team. Things are generally running smoothly. Hulkenberg is driving extremely well, but it's this lack of improvement. They're worse off than they were 6 years ago, because 2018 was actually a very good season for them when they were fighting all year with Renault for 4th place and best of the rest, and also Force India. But they're not an American team, and we saw the fallout with blocking Andretti from joining, who could have actually become like an actual American team. This one is not an American team. None of the senior staff are American. The closest they've got to having American drivers is that Pietro Fittipaldi has been their long-term reserve, who's now in IndyCar. He was born in Miami, even though he's a Fittipaldi, so he's Brazilian. And then in 2017 or 2018, they had Santino Ferrucci as a development driver, and then they sacked him after he was like breaking rate. He was driving around with a mobile phone in his hand, and I think he was being racist to Arjun Maini or something like that. And he's even now in IndyCar, he's still trying to start fights with people in the paddock. So good riddance. It's not an American team. Haas, they closed. I think the NASCAR team has folded now. Stuart Haas Racing as well quite recently. There's no goal that you think now. They've been here for 8 years. They haven't even got a single podium. So they're in a position that, say, Sauber used to be, of perpetual midfielder, but Sauber at least got podiums from time to time and a win as BMW Sauber. There's just not. I don't know where it's leading. I don't understand how they bring value to Formula One, but something like Andretti wouldn't.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I don't even know how this team Haas can justify the investment. I mean, he must be losing hand over fist. He must be losing money hand over fist. I don't really understand why this project is continuing. But that's for the internal financial team at Haas to decide and communicate back to Gene. RB were another team that I just thought didn't really perform this weekend. And, all these teams have a lot of issues with tire degradation. So it looks like, a lot of teams on this grid still have a lot of work to do in that area because there was a big gap at one point. And, Ricardo beat Tsunoda, and I'm sure his detractors will say, oh, look, Daniel's coming back. And I would point them to the standings this season where Yuki Tsunoda has over double the points of his teammate. So I maintain my hypothesis that Ricardo is not good enough for Formula One. And I reiterate what Jacques Villeneuve said last week. I don't think he should be in F1 past this season, and he's holding up young talent. So, anyways, he did beat Tsunoda this weekend, and that team has some work to do. And finally, not to kick a dead horse, but Williams were just absolutely atrocious this weekend. I mean, talk about a reality check. This looked like the Williams of the old days with Kubica and Russell. I mean, they were so far off the pace. And I think Logan in general, he said he couldn't even drive because there was so much tire degradation. But you've got to say, like, Williams, people think this project has a lot of potential with James Vale as the team principal. But yeah, I look at a weekend like this and I think, how can you go so far backwards? When at some races you're challenging for the top 10 and then all the other teams have made strides forward and now you're the slowest again. So it's a difficult one. I don't really know what to make of this Williams team. Like, are they well run? Are their drivers outperforming the car? Or are they terribly run and their drivers are some of the worst on the grid? It's just difficult for me to gauge this team. It's just so mediocre. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so now this was the first weekend in a while for Williams that they had both drivers on the same spec car. In qualifying, they ended up being the slowest. I mean, they've acknowledged in his Val's verdict, James said that we know that Barcelona is one of our weaker circuits. And at this point, I'm thinking it seems like the only strong circuits they have are Canada, Baku, and Vegas. Anywhere with massive long straights, that's where they do well, and no corners. So this year, both back row, the gap was very small in qualifying. You thought, okay, well, Logan's closer now. He's on the same spec car as Alex. In the race, and then Albon ended up starting from the pit lane. Within a few laps, he'd passed Sargent. He was on the softs, though, and he was on a better tyre. I think he was on softs, and Sargent was one of the ones that started on mediums. Or it was the other way around. Yeah, Albon started on mediums. Sargent passed Ricciardo on the first lap. Ricciardo passed him on the second lap. But then by the end of the race, Sargent had fallen to 30 seconds behind Albon, even with Albon having his own off through the gravel at one point. And he got lapped twice, and he finished behind Tsunoda, who himself had to take a penalty, I think, for either it was a drive-through penalty. It was either the track limits or the speeding, something, or he was on a 3-stop. So yeah, that gap it didn't make a huge amount of difference in the end, putting him on the same car. And this is the thing, because they're one of the main seats, at the moment the most plausible seat that Sainz would take. And there were some people thinking that there would be an announcement this weekend that Sainz is going to Williams. Maybe then we'd see someone properly challenge Albon, and we can see if he really is as good as we think he is. Because at the moment, Logan Sargent is giving him effectively zero competition. Like even on when he has a good race, all he can do is get close to him rather than actually be outright faster. But Albon, the only comparisons we've had, okay, we saw him as a rookie against Kvyat for half a season. Then he did a year and a half against Max and got trounced by him. Then he had Latifi, and now Logan. These are not, well, aside from one of them, these are not high-end teammates to be put against.
Very well said. I mean, I think the point here is that I've always thought Albon is nothing more than an average Formula One driver. I truly believe that. I think he's being flattered by some of the weakest teammates in modern F1 history. And yes, on a more traditional track, because that car has a lack of downforce, extra weight, high winds, the track temp, the tire deg, they struggle. So, we think that they'll be stronger in Austria and Silverstone. Yes, I understand that. But I also think their drivers are not maximizing this car at times. It's impossible for me to prove that because Albon is, as you say, decimating Logan Sargent, who I think we can all see has not really made any improvements from his rookie season in a major way. And as you mentioned, he's not capable of beating Albon in a straight fight. He's just out of his depth. So given how Albon struggled against Max, given the fact that he was never in the juniors rated as the top talent, I don't think anyone in the junior categories would have said Albon is a better talent than Lando or especially George. You've got to say that we don't know what the true potential of this car is. And it would be nice to finally get a proper gauge of Albon's raw speed. And I think Carlos Sainz could be an excellent barometer, even though Carlos will have to get used to the car for the first few races. But over time, I think we'd be able to see a true comparison. As I said before, do you think Carlos will even go to Williams, given how Alpine are now in the running to sign him and have the fifth fastest car, and Williams just dropped back and haven't really made significant improvements compared to the other teams? It's a tough one. I mean, if I'm Carlos Sainz, this is a tough decision because yes, James Vales and the operational team at Williams have potential, but Alpine are further ahead, as dysfunctional as they are, and they have a bigger budget, and they have Renault behind. It's a tough one. I mean, from Carlos's point, I wouldn't know which one to sign with, actually. So,
it depends
anyways,
if he's looking for what he's looking for in terms of his experience of it, because Alpine, yeah, the car is better. That they seem to have more know-how in terms of how to improve themselves, but the team management is a shambles. They don't present themselves very well. I can't picture him getting on that well with Gasly either. If he just wants to be in a competitive car, then he would go there. Williams' car is less competitive, but it's a much more congenial, much friendlier environment. He wouldn't get much competition, I don't think, from Albon, but he'd barely be in the running for points. And then the soon-to-be Audi, there's no, who knows? I mean, because I know that they've got Hulkenberg. Andrea Seidel is apparently struggling to attract any notable drivers, so they might just keep either Bottas or Zhou. You would hope they might give a chance to Maloney as their junior if we want to see more rookies. And again, he was a teammate to Hulkenberg at Renault, so that there's that familiarity. There's not. I feel like it makes not a huge amount of difference which one of the three he goes for, because either way it's a colossal downgrade from Ferrari, and it completely puts him out of the running of being competitive anymore.
I can see that. If I were a driver, and Carlos Sainz is not old at all, but he's becoming one of the older drivers. He's on his way there. He's in his late 20s, I believe, early 30s soon. Not old. That's not old at all. But, he's got to now also have a long-term view about, how many years he has left. And all I can think about is that at least Alpine are connected to Renault, and that if he ever wanted to do anything else, He could go and become a Renault brand ambassador. He could have a lifelong contract with Renault. He could go race for them in a different series. I always lean towards the team that has a bigger operation because that just means more opportunities for the driver. Williams are effectively not Williams. They're a portfolio company owned by a private equity company called Torrelson Ventures. We've seen it in every single sport. These private equity run teams or organizations always fail because private equity does not think about boosting the value at the, let me rephrase that. They don't think about the team's history and thinking about winning. The number one thing that they think about is maximizing their investment by reducing the amount of debt that they have to pay. And the way they do that is, they buy these companies with a lot of debt. They use the cash flows of the business to pay down that debt. They put very little of their own equity in. And then when they sell the company, they have a ton of upside that goes back to them. And, we saw this at Manchester United in a completely different sport, that the training facilities, when the Glazers took over, were the same 15 years after they took over because they didn't actually invest directly into the company. They were only looking at basically managing costs so that when they sold the team, they have equity upside preserved. And I just fear that's the exact same thing Doralton is going to do with Williams. I don't think we're going to ever see any kind of major improvement by this organization. I really think this is all hot air and fluff. You can never win with private equity backing you. They don't care about that. They only care about making money, which can be done in many other ways, and cutting costs, which isn't exactly what Williams need right now. They need to be investing into the team directly and hiring big names. And they're not really doing that. So if I were Sainz, I'd probably sign with Alpine. But you bring up some good points, Peter, and it's something to watch going into the future, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like none of them are in a good position, but Alpine's car it's definitely faster than Sauber and Williams. I mean, Sauber in this race, by their own standards, it wasn't a bad race. I mean, Zhou finished 13th and Bottas was 16th. Although Bottas had gone from 12th to 16th, and Zhou went from 15th to 13th. So that's not so bad. Good qualify. I mean, Zhou made Q2 for the first time in qualifying, although he's actually got he's actually bottom in terms of average gap to pole. He has the worst times, but he's still behind Sargent. Their pit stops weren't 2 minutes long each time, so they got that done. So by their own standards, yeah, not bad, but still just not good either.
Zhou said he made a breakthrough this weekend. He said that with the setup of the car and the way he was working with his engineers, he felt like this was a breakthrough weekend. So I'm very curious to see if he will now start to consistently leave Valtteri in his wake. That would be a very interesting turn of events. So very positive for Zhou, despite finishing 13th. I don't know what to say about Bottas, really. I don't know what he's still doing here. I mean, the same old issue with him. He doesn't really understand the concept of tire management at a high level, and he completely ruined his tires. They left him out a bit too long in the first stint, fine, but his tire management was shocking, and you got to say Zhou just did a much better job in the race. So that's another team that needs a complete overhaul, but at least they're not going to be around in disguise for much longer. So I would say a good weekend for Zhou and a very poor one from Valtteri, in my opinion. So that's how I would characterize it.
I mean, Valtteri, yeah, he made in the first stint. We saw him do an overtake on somebody, can't remember who, but yeah, in general, he does have that problem that his racecraft is just non-existent, and he is just so desperately invisible in races. Even more, I mean, he was already fairly invisible when he was at Mercedes and had the fastest car, but now it's just so absent. But he's in the running to be teammates of Hulkenberg next year, and Hulkenberg's just going to walk all over him. I get that he brings experience, maybe from the perspective of a technical understanding or setting the cars up, but he just doesn't bring the results with that. Whereas Zhou is only bringing money.
It's amazing, isn't it? You look at this pipeline, and it is a dream for the older drivers. I have never seen this where a big name like Audi is coming into F1 and they don't have any good options. I mean, it's unbelievable how dry the talent. I mean, and interrupt me if you think I'm being harsh here, but look at who's available to them right now. And you got to say, this is one of the weakest pipelines I've ever seen in Formula One. I mean, some unproven young drivers, nobody even knows if they're any good. You've got Bottas in the running. I don't really know who else. If I were Andreas Seidel, I would be pounding, and I mean calling Sebastian Vettel every single day to convince him to come back to Formula One, because I don't see this Audi project getting off to a good start with somebody who never scored a podium in their life, in their entire F1 career, and some other no name that's ostensibly going to be put into that seat. They need a big name signing, and they need someone to really inspire the mechanics when they walk in for the first time to a new project. And I'd say Kimi Räikkönen should come back, but I don't think he's interested. I still think he has the talent to do well, at least in the races. But if I were Andreas Seidel, I mean, quit bugging around with all these other drivers, mate. Get Vettel on the phone and get him in that seat, because that's a better option than any of these drivers. I mean, do we really think that Sebastian Vettel would perform at a lower level than Valtteri Bottas? I mean, get real, son. No way. No way. Vettel is somebody I think Audi need. I really do think they need somebody like that for their flagship project. And between all these other names that are being floated out there, I don't think a single one is a convincing candidate, which is a dream for the older drivers like Alonso and Hamilton, because it just further gives them confidence that no one's going to challenge them in the sport. No one's really going to push them out until they're ready to leave. It's absolutely shocking to me. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Peter, but I find it ridiculous.
I mean, I say this as a Vettel fan. I think it would take a lot of persuasion to get him to come back, but to come back to any team, if he did, I don't think he'd want to come back to something like Audi. He wouldn't want to come back with the perspective of, building a new team up from the ground and developing it at all. He'd want to come back and be put in the Red Bull and just be winning races and claim another championship. The development role wouldn't, because as well as his form dropping off when he was at Aston Martin, he would have now had 2 years out of the sport, and that's never going to help you. Kimi coming back, well, he'd be 45. That would be quite an interesting age to make a return. What would be his second return now? I don't think that would necessarily go much better than it did when he was with them with Alfa Romeo. We're in a position.
Speaking of Alfa Romeo, Peter, what about Antonio Giovinazzi?
That is an option. He's somewhat bound to Ferrari and the Ferrari family as one of their WEC drivers, but yeah, he could come back in that drove there before, team knows him. Whether or not, I don't know if he's someone that's known for having a good technical understanding, and he's the kind of person that can do that, because I feel most of that was Kimi when they were teammates. And it was definitely a sort of master-apprentice sort of dynamic with them. But yeah, you could. He's an option to come back, but I feel like there would be this feeling of we could do better if you brought him back. It would just be a kind of random. There are lots of people like that. You could, like in that line, you could bring back Wehrlein and put him in there, or Felipe Nasr, or one of those, just a midfield driver from the last decade, and just throw them in. Or you could give a chance to a rookie like Zane Maloney, because now we're in a position where, depending on how the cards fall, we could have 5 rookies next year. I mean, I'll make a small aside relating to Formula 2, because this weekend, the 2 Prema drivers, Andrea Kimi Antonelli and Ollie Behrman, in the feature race, they finished 12th and 14th. And these are meant to be F1's big stars of the future. And Kimi is increasingly looking like he's going to get the Mercedes seat now that they've removed the no under 18s rule. Behrman, he did FP1 for Haas this weekend, one of several he's doing, and so he looks like a shoe-in to get a seat with them. But they're completely underperforming. And we've seen some exceptional driving from people like Paul Aron, who is an ex-Mercedes junior, is not currently part of an academy. And Zane Maloney started really strongly, starting to tail off. He's at least an academy driver. But we could have next year, we could potentially see Antonelli, Behrman, Doohan, Maloney, and I guess if Liam Lawson counts as a rookie, you could have all 5 of those. And that would be great just from making things a bit less stale and changing it up. But none of them are really that impressive at the moment, or they're falling below expectations.
That's a very interesting point, and I think it may well be worth the gamble if you don't think any of the experienced drivers are worth it, or you can't secure the services of somebody like Sebastian Vettel. I think 5 rookies on a grid. I mean, that's bound to lead to an accident at some point, isn't it? But it may just be what F1 needs. You know, a little bit of refreshment, a little bit of excitement, and who knows, maybe one of these rookies really defies the odds and rises to the occasion, and proves us all wrong. It also shows how important it is to be associated with some academy nowadays. I don't like that. You know, these drivers that are not associated with them, just even if they're, like you alluded to, outperforming the academy drivers, they don't get a look in. I don't think that's right. You know, you should be picking the best driver. It doesn't matter if he's in the academy or not. So that's a bit sad to hear that. But if there was ever a time for these rookies to make a debut, the next few seasons, especially next season, could be the best opportunity. So that's definitely a viable option. It's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, he's been one I've been thinking about for a while because Maloney has started the season so strongly. He seemed like an obvious shoe-in, and because another thing is that because in this year is the first year of the new spec Formula 2 cars, which are effectively the same as the Formula 1 cars. So if you're driving well in these, it would suggest that you're going to drive well in the Formula 1 cars. And we've seen that Behrman is not doing brilliantly, and again, Kimi is doing well from the perspective of if you think he's somebody who's jumped up from Frecker and skipped Formula 3 to go to Formula 2. And there's another driver in F2 called Joshua Dirksen who has done the same. He has he's got a podium, but Kimi doesn't. Other than that, he hasn't scored any points. Although in the race yesterday, he looked like he could win it, and then his engine died. But he's someone who was just one of the kind of middle ground ones in Frecker. But Kimi, if people weren't assuming he was like the messiah of Formula 1, you would think this is fairly good. He's 6th or 7th in the standings, even with no podiums. But because everyone's convinced, like some people thought he might take Logan's seat this weekend because Logan had such a bad race in Canada, and because they took away the no under 18s rule. But if he's just doing kind of average now in cars which are very, very similar to the Formula 1 cars. And there are other drivers doing really well. And it's like, maybe you should be looking at those. And that's why I've been saying that Paul Aron could be a very good fit for Williams, even though Sainz would be a better option overall. But I need more rookies in there. There has to be room for Liam Lawson somewhere. You can't give Checo an extension and then keep Ricciardo for no reason and can completely cast out Lawson, because I think his contract with Red Bull, it currently ends in September. So they've got a few months to try and decide what they do with him. But yeah, we need more rookies. We used to get 5 or 6 a year, and now we just don't have that.
I wonder if Netflix has anything to do with that. I really mean that. Because then drivers who are existing get these fan bases who become like cultish followers of a driver. And it becomes difficult to justify removing them from a commercial perspective. I mean, Villeneuve already alluded to it, that Ricciardo is in Formula 1 because of his personality and Netflix presence. And really, if he didn't have that, I think he would have already been gone a while ago. And you've got to say at this point, you know, your line of thinking is probably the sensible one. And the reason I say that is because you're right. We haven't seen such a sparse entry of rookies into Formula 1 for ages. When was the last time we had like 3 or 4 rookies on a grid? Ages ago. So I think that's what F1 needs, honestly. Some of these people they're just not good enough anymore, and they need to make way. You know, I'd like to see 4 or 5 rookies from F2 given a chance. You know, we need that kind of excitement, those drivers who just go for it, who are learning on the go, but they're fearless. and it always makes things more interesting. In my opinion, imagine 4 or 5 of them on the grid could get a bit scary at times, but I think I take that over what we have right now, frankly. So let's see if the teams have the bravery to do that.
The commercial side, it definitely plays a huge role. I mean, we know that Checo alone is responsible for like 60% of Red Bull's merch sales. So that's he's basically a pay driver. Gunter has left. He's left Haas, but now he's getting all this punditry stuff and all that. He just can't keep him away. But I think when it comes to taking on rookies, not only do the drivers need it, but also I think it's also for the good of Formula 2 because it lends it some credibility. Because we're having this repeated thing now where you win the title and then you don't go to Formula 1. I mean, we've seen Piastri eventually did. He had to get some stepping stones to make it there. Drogovic is probably never getting a seat with Aston Martin. I doubt anyone else is particularly interested. That moment's gone. Pourchaire won the title last year, but then he's Super Formula. Then he went to IndyCar, and then they just kicked him out for someone else who has more money. So now he's got nothing to do. So it's for Formula 2. They need to make it viable because if you think about the drivers, they're spending £2 million to race in it in cars that they already know handle like absolute arse, stall if you so much as look at first gear. The tyres don't work. They break down all the time, and that is hugely costly. And then on top of that, even if you drive the socks off the car and win the title, there is no guarantee you'll even go to Formula 1. So they need to start improving this pipeline because otherwise it's like, well, what's the point of going to Formula 2 if I'm just going to end up in Formula E or IndyCar at the end of the day and just get completely sidestepped by somebody who either has a massive smile or a massive wallet?
Nothing to add to that, frankly. No, I think that's the unfortunate state of events at the moment, and we can only hope that some of these teams step up and reward talent rather than something else. Is there anything else you think we missed or wanted to touch on here? I think we've covered pretty much every team. Let me ask you. What would you rate this race out of 10? And who are your top 3 drivers? And who was your flop of the race?
Okay, so the race, I'll give it a 7. I think slightly on the basis that it was a Spanish Grand Prix, and for a Spanish Grand Prix, it wasn't bad. It was just that we at least had, if it had just been everyone doing a 1-stopper, it's like, well, this is dull. But because it was a 2-stop and for some a 3-stop, that created a degree of uncertainty, and we saw all three compounds getting used. And we could see that Red Bull were not the fastest car, even though they still won the race. But then my top 3 drivers, Max was, again, near flawless. Lewis had a very good race, although one thing I failed to mention, his start was very poor. He also banged wheels with one of the Ferraris on the run to turn 1, and if they'd hit each other any harder, that could have been a very big accident. And he was almost behind them by turn 1. Other than his poor start, he had a very good race. Again, Lando got driver of the day. Everyone's praising him for not winning in the fastest car. But further back, I suppose Gasly, just to be best of the rest and just knuckle down and do his job. The flop, I'm torn between Checo and Sargent. I suppose Checo on the basis that by his standards, this was a good race because there weren't any obvious mistakes. It was just him being slow.
Yeah, I agree with your top 3. That was my top 3 as well. And I think it is shocking, just to repeat what you said, that the fans are giving Norris driver of the day when, again, just repeating exactly what you just said 30 seconds ago, that they're giving him driver of the day despite the fact he failed to win in the fastest car in Formula 1. It's just, I don't understand that. Flop of the race for me is going to be Logan Sargent. And for me, it's not, because Checo at least made up some positions, as mediocre as he was. It was between Sargent and Magnussen for me, because Magnussen really underperformed and had a jump start. But Sargent he was so far off the pace. I mean, it was just, it's inexcusable unless he had some kind of a car issue. It's ridiculous. right? I mean, the gap to Albon was bigger than I've seen it in a long time. So I'm gonna go with Logan Sargent. That was a poor show.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a close one with them, but it was just disappointing because we thought, okay, now same spec car, maybe it'll be better, and it ended up not making much of a difference. But yeah, so that was the first of what is a triple header. We've got in 2 weeks we've got Silverstone, and then this weekend we've got Austria. Austria always serves up a good race. Again, it's a very strong. This is basically Max's fortress, where the Orange Army are. He's won several, at least half a dozen times here. As long as there isn't, it should be a good one. It's looked like it might rain. It's another sprint weekend though, and I'm sure we're going to have endless bollocks with track limits. But yeah, it should. I hope it will serve up something good.
Yeah, I expect Aston to struggle quite badly, in my opinion, in both these races coming up. I expect Williams to be a bit quicker than the slowest team in the next 2 races. But above all, I think that McLaren are going to have the fastest car. They're going to be challenged by the usual suspects. And I want to see the McLaren drivers step up and start winning races dominantly, as they should be. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out. But I think they're going to be close again. I don't think we're going to go to circuits anymore and have a driver win by 40 seconds or dominate like Max used to do last season. I think every race is going to be close, and it's going to come down to the drivers. And that's what we want to see, I think, as fans.
Yeah, we just have to hope that even if it's taken almost halfway through the season, that somebody can finally get under Max's skin. But yeah, you've been listening to DRS Train Podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train Podcast. Make sure to tune into our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.